Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We are holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Aleph and we will be learning today in Yirtzeh Hashem Daf Chaf Aleph Amid Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchas Tzitzis and we pick up today on the bottom of Chaf Amid Beis, Siman Yud Aleph Halacha Vav. Says the Mechaber, Im Asa'am Mitzemer Gozel. If you make the tzitzis out of stolen wool. Now we're going to have to see exactly what does this mean, stolen wool. Exactly what is it that you stole. But in any case, says the Mechaber, Im asam mitzemer gozel, if you made the tzitzis out of stolen wool, psulim, the tzitzis are puzzle. Why is that? Because the pasuk says, va'asu lahem. The pasuk says, we say it in Kriya Shema twice a day, va'asu lahem tzitzis. They should make for themselves tzitzis. And we learn from the word lahem, for them, misha lahem. The pasuk could have said, va'asu tzitzis. The pasuk could have said, va'asu tzitzis, they shall make tzitzis al kanfei v'gdehem. It's not what the pasuk says. The pasuk says, va'asu lahem tzitzis. They should make for themselves tzitzis. So from this word lahem, Chazal darshan lahem, misha lahem. It has to come from wool that belongs to them. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katnu Chav Zayin, Lahem Misha Lahem. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Nire Pashut, it seems simple, Dehu Hadin Im Lakach HaTzitzis B'Hakafa. Let's say you purchased tzitzis on credit. Hakafa is credit. V'hamoicher Ayol V'Nafek Azuzeh. And the seller is coming after the purchaser for his money. So Ruvain bought tzitzis from Shimon. He bought it on credit. Now, there's nothing wrong with buying tzitzis on credit, and you could use the tzitzis after you purchased them, even if you did not pay for them yet. So if you went into a Judaica store, and the Judaica store is one of these stores that has a book or a computer file where they give you credit and they put it down on your bill, so you could buy a pair of tzitzis and have them put it down on the account, and you could be yotze the mitzvah of tzitzis with those tzitzis even before you pay off the account. That's not a problem, because the moicher sold it to you, and he's very happy to be makning it to you. The case over here of the Chavetz Chaim is, v'hamoicher ayol v'nafek azuzeh, the moicher is coming to collect. So the moicher added up your account, and then he sent you a bill, and he said, okay, you owe $250, and it's due in 7 days, and then you didn't pay it, and then the guy calls you up and says, you owe me $250, and the guy doesn't want to pay, like the Chavetz Chaim says. The moicher is chasing after his money, and the purchaser doesn't want to pay. So says the Chavetz Chaim, in that case, to be dina enam shaloi, then the halacha is that it really doesn't belong to him. Like the halacha comes out in Choshen Mishpat Siman Kuf Tzadik Sif Yud Ayin Sham. The Chalki Hai Gavna, or any similar type of case, in Kain Lo Yotza Min Adin B'Tzitzis, then you wouldn't be yotza with those tzitzis because doesn't fulfill the requirement of Lahem. The Ayin B'Biur Halacha, and he sends us to the Biur Halacha, which we'll take a look at in a minute. The same halacha would apply to anything else that needs lachem, like dalad minim, lulav and esrig, you need lachem. So if you bought it on credit, and the person is coming after you for the money and you're not paying him, it's a big shaila if you could be yotze the mitzvah. Same thing, Benegea in Yonah to Yuma, I'm recording this on Masi Shabbos of Shabbos HaGadol. If somebody were to purchase matzah on credit, and he resists paying his bill, he's going to have a problem being yotze with that matzah. Okay, now, what does the Biur Halacha say here? So if you take a look at the Biur Halacha on the bottom of Chaf Amid Beis, no, not that, near the bottom on Chaf Amid Beis, Dibra Maschel Im Asa'am. So the Mechaber said, Im Asam Mitzemer Gozel, and the pashtus of the Mechaber is that the Mechaber is referring to the chutei hatzitzis, the strings of the tzitzis. Somebody stole wool and fashioned tzitzis strings out of that stolen wool. That's the case that the Mechaber is addressing, and he says that you're not yotza. Says the Biur Halacha over here, says the Chavetz Chaim, Ayin Prima Gadim Shakasav, take a look at the Prima Gadim who writes, Tehu Hadin Im Gazal Talis. The same halacha would apply if somebody stole a talis. Not that he stole wool, and then fashioned chutei tzitzis out of the stolen wool. Let's say somebody stole a talis, he stole a four-cornered beged. The hittel by tzitzis mishaloi, and then he took tzitzis strings that properly belongs to him, but he affixed them to a stolen talis. Nami loikia mitzvah tzitzis al yedei levishasaizu. He can't be yoitza the mitzvah tzitzis by putting on this stolen talis that has tzitzis attached to it. Why? The ksusecha ksiv bakra, because the pasuk says gedilim tasalach al arba kanfis ksusecha. You should put tzitzis, you should affix tzitzis to the four corners of ksusecha, your garment. The garment has to belong to you. V'ayin masha kasavdu b'Mishnah Berurah if katan chavzayin le'inyan akafas tzitzis v'adin le'inyan talis. So the same halacha would apply here if you bought a talis on credit. Okay. So we had here at the beginning of Sivav in the Mechaber the concept of lahem by tzitzis. The tzitzis have to belong to you. So in the Mechaber's words, if you stole wool and you fashioned tzitzis out of the stolen wool, you can't be yoitza. The tzitzis are puzzle because of this requirement of lahem misha lahem. Now let's see the Ramah. Top line Chaf Aleph Amid Aleph Haga says the Ramah V'dafka shegazal hachutin. The Ramah says, and the pashtus, the way the Mishnah Berurah learns this Ramah, is that the Ramah is being mefaresh the Mechaber. He's not arguing on the Mechaber, he's explaining the Mechaber. So the Ramah says, when the Mechaber said that you stole wool and you made tzitzits out of stolen wool, what does the Mechaber mean? Says the Ramah, V'dafka shegazal hachutin. We're talking about where he stole tzitzis strings. So they were already fashioned, the wool was already fashioned into strings. And what did he steal? He stole strings. Avalim gazal tzemer. But if somebody actually stole raw wool, v'asan chutin, and then he spun that raw wool into chutei tzitzis, kesherim, then the tzitzis would be kosher. Why would they be kosher? So we'll see here in the Mishnah Berurah. The difference is, if you stole strings and now you fashioned tzitzits out of the strings, you're not yoitze because these strings are stolen strings. And you're not being mekayim lahem misha lahem because they don't belong to you. When a thief steals something, it doesn't become his property. So you're not yoitze the tzitzis because you're not meeting the requirement of lahem misha lahem. But, says the Ramah, if somebody stole raw wool, and then he took the raw wool and he spun the raw wool into strings, now he is Yaitza. Why? Because now you have a Shinoi Hashem. This, when you stole it, it was called Tzemer. It was called wool. But then when you went ahead and you spun it into threads, now it's called Chutin. Now it's called strings. So now you have a Shinoi Hashem. And with a Shinui Hashem, and we're going to see in the Mishnah Berurah, a Shinui Hashem together with Yush. Okay, so again, what's the case here? Let's say Ruvain Chas v'Chalila stole raw wool from Shimon. Shimon comes, where's my wool? Vaili l'chesarin kiss. I lost my raw wool, I'm never going to see it again. So Shimon was miyayish. That's step number one. Shimon gave up. Now we know this is Baba Metzia 101. When you find an Aveda in the street, in order for you to be kind of the Aveda, for you to be allowed to take that Aveda and be kind of it, what you need is Yiyosh HaBailim. It has to be that the Bailim were miyayish. The Bailim gave up on it. Now there's a big difference between an Aveda and Gezel. By an Aveda, Ruvain is walking in the street and he sees on the ground a very nice pair of gloves. If he picks up that pair of gloves, in order for him to be kaina that pair of gloves, he needs one ingredient. He needs that the fellow who lost it was miyayish. If he was miyayish, so now his ownership is gone because of the yush, and now I pick it up, I'm kaina it. Now it's my gloves. Now, of course, I'm being very oversimplifying tremendously here. There are Avedas that you're allowed to keep. There are Avedas that you're not allowed to keep. Does it have a Siman? Does it not have a Siman? Where did you find it? Etc. Etc. We're not going into a whole Bab Mitzvah here. But just Choshen Mishpat 101, if you find an Aveda in the street, in the oifen that you're allowed to keep it, the ingredient that you need is you need Yesh HaBailam. You need the Bailam to have given up on it, and now his ownership is gone. Now you could be kained. Not so by Gezel. Not so a thief. The difference between somebody who finds an Aveda and somebody who steals something is when you find an Aveda in the street and you pick it up, behetera bal liyadcha. It came to you in a permissible fashion. You didn't do an avla. If you found an Aveda in Rishus HaRabim without a Siman and everything else, and you picked it up, you aren't over an Isser. It's not be'isura bal liyadeh. It didn't come to your hands through Isser. It's behetera bal liyadcha. It came to your hands through heter. Therefore, all you need is Yesh HaBailam. If the Bailam gave up on it, their ownership is gone. You picked it up, you're kain it, now you own it. But by a thief, where be'isura bal liyadeh, it came to his hands through Isser, he went in and he stole something, he took something he wasn't allowed to take, over there Yush is not enough. The thief cannot be kind of something that he stole because the Bailam were miyayish. What does a thief need? Funny way to say it, what does a thief need? But in order for a thief to be kind of what he stole, Yush is not enough. He also needs some kind of a shinui. There has to be a change made in the object that he stole. And we're going to see here in the Mishnah Berurah, and we've covered this before in Hilchos Talad Minim, we covered it. There's one type of shinoi, which is called a shinoi hashem. The name of the item changed. Trying to think of a good example with the name of an item changes. Okay, so there's the classic example in Baba Metzia. Let's say somebody stole a sheet of plywood. And now he took the sheet of plywood and he nailed it onto his shed. He put it on, he's making a shed, and he needed a sheet of plywood for the roof. So he took it and he nailed it up to the roof. Well, before it was called a sheet of plywood. It was called lumber. Now it's not called lumber anymore. Now it's called a roof. So that is a shinoi hashem. You made a change. Before it was called lumber, wood, plywood. Now it's called roof. That's a shinoi hashem. So what the Ramah is saying over here is, when the Mechaber says that somebody who stole wool and fashioned tzitzis out of it, it's puzzle and he can't be yotze the mitzvah, says the Ramah, when is that? The dafka shegazal achutim. That's if he stole strings. You stole strings and you put it onto your beged, that's stolen. It's not yours because it was already strings and now it's strings. So, okay, you're not kainit and you're not yotze. However, says the Ramah, avalim gazar tzemer va'asan chutin. But if you stole raw wool and then you spun it into threads, kisherim, then it's kosher. So now let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. With this preface, let's take this introduction. Let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah, 3 lines down. It's called Chavches. V'dafka, it's only true that you're not yotze the mitzvah if you actually stole strings. Va'oz, in that case, if you stole strings, says the Mishnah Berurah, afilu nisyashu habaylim, even if the victim of your theft was miyayish, he gave up on ever seeing those strings again, still the tzitzis apostle. Why? The yish loikana. Because yish is not kinda for a thief. A thief is not kinda what he stole through yish alone. Why? Because be'isura baliyade. Va'afilu im loy hayu achutin shizurin, even if the strings were not twisted. If you remember, we learned in the previous share that tzitzit strings have to be twisted, right? You double it over and you twist it so that it's one string fashioned out of a double strand. What if you stole a string and then you went ahead and you doubled it over and you twisted it? Is that enough for the thief to be kained? Says the Mishnah Berurah, no. Even if the tzitzis that were stolen were not yet twisted, v'hu shizaron, and the thief twisted them, that does not make a shinoi, because it was a string before, and now it's still a string. You're right. Before it wasn't a twisted string. Now it is a twisted string. But the name doesn't change. It's still called string. So there is no shinoi. So again, says the Mishnah Berurah is explaining over here. The Ramah says that when the Mechaber says if you stole tzemer and you made tzitzis, it's possible. That's talking about if you stole strings. If you stole strings, you can't be yotze the mitzvah, they're puzzle. Why? Because even if the Bailam were miyayish, a thief is not kinda what he stole through yish alone, and there is no shinoi here, because it was a string, and it still is a string. And even if when he stole it, it wasn't shizurin, it wasn't a twisted string, and now he twists it, that's not recognized as a shinoi. It was a string before, and it's still a string now. That was Eis Katan Chav Ches. Now Eis Katan Chav Tes, Shegazal Hachutin. So first, the Mishnah Berurah just tells us you should know that the Magen Avram learns differently here. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ein b'Magen Avram sif Katan Yod v'ledvarav. According to the Magen Avram, Hagazu Chaylik al Mechaber. The Magen Avram learns this Ramah differently. He learns that the Ramah is arguing on the Mechaber. The Magen Avram says that when the Mechaber said Im asa'am mitzemer gazel, the Mechaber meant even if you stole raw wool and then twisted it into strings, you're still not yotze. That's how the Magen Avram learned the Mechaber. We're not going to go into it. Eis Katan Lamed Kesherim. So the Ramah said, if you stole chutin, if you stole strings, that's when the halacha of the Mechaber is true, that you're not yotze. Because even if there was yush, there was no shinoi. It was a string, it still is a string. The thief isn't kind of the strings. He doesn't fulfill the requirement of lahem yishel lahem, and he can't be mekayim the mitzvah of tzitzis. But if he stole raw wool, and he turned the raw wool into strings, now it's ksherim. Why is that? Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Lamed. Hataz mevaer. The Taz explains the Ramah, and he says like this: the Iri Ramah. The Ramah's case is heichid dehaviyush gamkein. The Ramah is talking about a case where Ruvain chas v'chalila stole raw wool from Shimon. Shimon was miyayish, and we said yish alone is not enough. Shimon was miyayish. Then, after Shimon was miyayish, Ruvain took the raw wool, twisted it into chutin, and now he made a shinui shem. So now you have a combination of yush, and the yush came first. First Shimon was miyayish, and that's critical. First Shimon was miyayish on the raw wool. Then Ruvain took the raw wool, twisted it into strings, and by doing so, he made a Shinui Hashem. So now you have the combination of Yush and Shinui Hashem, and with that combination, Ruvain is kinda the strings from Shimon, and now he could be Mekayim Lahem Yishel Lahem, and now he could be Mekayim the mitzvah of tzitzis with these strings. Let's see it inside. Hataz Mivar, the Taz explains the Ramah, and he says, the Ramah is discussing a case Heichid have a yish gamkein, where there was also yish. So in my case, Ruvain stole the raw wool from Shimon, and Shimon was biyayish. And therefore, says the Chavetz Chaim, the kanya biyish v'shinui Hashem. Now Ruvain is going to be kind of the strings with a combination of Shimon's yish and Ruvain's shinui Hashem by changing it from wool into strings. To make karet semer, because when Ruvain stole it, it was raw wool, and it was called tzemer, it was called wool. V'hashta chutin, and now it's called chutin, now it's called strings. So now you have a combination of Shimon's yush and Ruvain's making a shinui Hashem, and with that, Ruvain is kind of the strings, and he's mekayim lahem yishel lahem, and he can be yotze the mitzvah tzitzis. That's the way the Taz learns. Aval Magen Avram kasav, but the Magen Avram writes, the midasasa maharamah, from the fact that the Ramah wrote this in a very general way. Does the Ramah say a word about yish? No. The Ramah says, Avalim gazal tzemer, if you stole wool, va'asan chutin, and you turned it into strings, Geshayrim, it's kosher. He doesn't say a word about Yush. So the Magen Avram is medayik in the Ramah. And the Magen Avram says, Dimi desasam Ramah, from the fact that the Ramah wrote this in a very general way, mashma, the implication is, disvirle, that the Ramah holds, da afilu koidem Yush kosher. The Ramah says you don't need the Yush of Shimon. The Taz says that the Ramah's case is Ruvain stole the raw wool from Shimon. Shimon was miyayish. How is Ruvain kind of the strings? Because he has a combination of Shimon's Yush and his own Shinui Hashem. The Magen Avram says no. The Ramah doesn't say a word about Yush. So the implication of the Ramah is, when the Ramah says that you could be yotzei tzitzis, if you went ahead and you stole raw wool and you turned it into chutin, that's even without Shimon's Yush. You don't need Shimon's Yush. Why? Why wouldn't you need Shimon's Yush? So explains the Chavetz Chaim, Tekanya b'shinoi maisa. Because the Magen Avram held that Ruvain is kind of what he stole. He's kind of the wool that he stole from Shimon, not with Shinui Hashem. He's kind of with a much more powerful Shinui. He's kind of with Shinui Maisa. Shinui Maisa is affecting a change in the physical nature of the item that you stole. For example, let's say somebody steals a tree. Okay? Somebody chopped down a beautiful oak tree in his backyard. Shimon cut down a beautiful oak tree, very valuable hardwood, in his backyard. Reuven came, stole the tree. Okay, so far, he's a thief. All right. Now, he takes it into his workshop, and he has a mill in his workshop. And he mills the tree into a beam, and then he goes ahead and he takes the beam, and he runs it through a planer, and he runs it through a jointer, and now he has a beautiful beam. You know what kind of shinui that is? Well, it is a Shinui Hashem, because before it was a tree and now it's a beam. But it's not only a Shinui Hashem, it's a Shinui Maisa. This is, he made a physical change in what he stole. He took the tree and he made it ice tree. It's not a tree anymore. He cut it up. He milled it. He planed it. He sanded it. He made a Shinui Maisa. He affected a physical change in the guf of the object that he stole. Shinui Maisa is much more powerful than a Shinui Hashem, and a Shinui Maisa is kind of without Yush. Why is a Shinui Maisa kind of without Yush? Oh, that's a very deep question. But on a simple level, one of the simplest reasons why you're kind of with a Shinui Maisa is because it's not the item that you stole anymore. It's just not the item that you stole. It's not the same item. Now, you're going to have to pay for the item that you stole, but the item that you stole is gone. It's not here anymore. You changed it. So the item that you stole is gone. This is not the item that you stole. So now you kind it. Now it's yours. And you'll have to pay. You'll have to make monetary remuneration to the victim. But you're not going to give him the item back because the item is gone. So the Magen Avram learns that if somebody steals raw wool and then he goes ahead and he twists it, he spins it into thread, that's not only a Shinui Hashem, that's a Shinui Maisa. And therefore the Magen Avram learns the Ramah that when the Ramah says that if you steal raw wool and you turn it into chutin, yoyotza, you don't need Yush. For Shinui Hashem you need Yush. But this is not just a Shinui Hashem, this is Shinui Maisa. Now, what exactly the machlokes to Magen Avram and the Taz is, why is this Shinui Hashem or is it Shinui Maisa? I think partially it has to do with how reversible is the change. The Taz seems to learn that the spinning the raw wool into thread is a very reversible change. And the truth is, if you take raw wool and you just spin it into a thread, I think it is reversible. You could just pull the fibers apart. So the Taz says this is only a Shinui Hashem. It's a reversible Shinui Hashem. That's a shvacha Shinui, and therefore you need the combination of the Shinui and Yush. With the Magen Avram seems to hold that no, this is just a new chayfetz already, even perhaps if it is reversible. Not sure. But this is a more permanent change, and it does not require Yush. Okay. Now let's go weiter in the Mishnah Berurah's Cotton Lamed. V'chein mashba me'agra b'Berurah. He says that the gra is mashba like the Magen Avram. Ta'atamu mishum shina ma'isa ayin sham. Okay. Now the Chavetz Chaim goes on to another case. V'im gazal chutin. Let's say somebody stole chutin. Now the Rabbah said that it's when you steal chutin that really the halacha of the mechaber is in play. If you steal chutin, so now you can't be kind of them, because even with Yush alone you're not kind, and they're already chutin. So there is no shinoi, not shina ma'isa, not shina Hashem, not anything. So you're not kind, you're not yotza. So now says the Chavetz Chaim, let's say v'im gazal chutin. Let's say Ruvain stole strings from Shimon, but then u'mecharon la'acher lifnei Yish. Ruvain stole them from Shimon and he sold them to Levi, but Levi bought them before Shimon is miyayish. Lo yotza hasheni b'hatzitzis. Levi can't be yotza because Shimon was never miyayish. That's ingredient number one. There was no shinoi at all, so Levi can't be yotza. Now, you'll tell me there is a shinoi. There's a third shinoi. So far we learned about shinoi Hashem and shinoi Maisa, but there's another shinoi too, and that's shinoi Rishus. When you change the ownership or the property of the stolen object. In this case, Ruvain stole the strings from Shimon and he sold them to Levi. So it's tempting to say that in the transference from Ruvain to Levi, there's a Shina Rishus. But Shina Rishus without Yush isn't kaina. So it's very nice, Ruvain stole them from Shimon, then he sold them to Levi. Levi can't be kind of them because even though there was a Shina Rishus, there was no Yush. You need Yush. The Shina Rishus below Yush, loy kana, v'loy karina be'vasu lahem. So you don't fulfill the requirement of lahem mishel lahem, and Levi cannot be yotza. Okay, next case. V'hem acher shebal yad asheni nisyashu abaylam. Let's say Ruvain stole it from Shimon, sold it to Levi. Shimon was not yet miyayish, but 2 days after Ruvain sold it to Levi, they hear that Shimon was miyayish. So now do you have the combination of Yush and Shina Rishus? Now Shimon was miyayish, and there already was a Shina Rishus from Ruvain to Levi. Could Levi be yotza now? Says the Mishnah Berurah in Choshen Mishpat-based Siman Shin on Gimel Siv Gimel Diyesh Deis Pazer. This is a very famous machlokes whether or not the combination of Yush and Shina Rishus is effective to effect a change of ownership if the Yush came after the Shina Rishus. If it came before the Shina Rishus, then it is effective. But what if it came after the Shina Rishus? That's the machlokes. Next case. V'im nisyashu. But if Shimon was miyayish, v'achakach becharon, if Ruvain stole it from Shimon, and Shimon says, vayli l'chasar and kiss, so you know Shimon was miyayish, and then Ruvain sold it to Levi, then kana hasheni es tzitzis, then Levi is kind of the tzitzis, and he could wear them and be yotze the mitzvah. V'afalinian bracha mashma me'amagan Avram is Siman Tafresh Mem Tesiv Beis in Hilchas Dalaminim. We learned this together. It's mashma for the Magen Avram that if there was Yush before Ruvain sold it to Levi, and then Ruvain sold it to Levi is kaina, and he can even make a bracha. The Yul Kalavarich Bazeh. Vein by Mishum Mitzvah Baba Avera. And there's no Indian of Mitzvah Baba Avera. There's no problem of Mitzvah Baba Avera. Kevin Shavul like Gazal. Because Levi didn't steal anything. Levi, Behetera Baliyade. Levi bought something from Ruvain. He didn't know it was stolen property. So it's Behetera Baliyade. And there's a Shina Rishus, and there was Yish before he got it. So his Yotzid can even make a bracha. V'chein Pasak Amach Tzashekel. Achein, a Pribegadim Sham, B'Shem HaLavush Machmer Bazeh. Pribegadim in the name of the Lavush is Machmer. The Gamataz B'Sim L'Chafei, V'Agral Sham, Machmirin Bazeh. Okay, now let's go back to the top line in the Shulchan Aruch and continue with the words of the Ramah, near the end of the line. So, we saw from the Mechaber, if you stole wool and you fashioned tzitzis out of it, the tzitzis are puzzle because there's a requirement of lahem, misha lahem. The Ramah said that's only if you stole what was already strings, because then you can't be kainit, because even with Yush, you only have Yush. Yush loikana, Yush alone is not kaina, so you can't be yaitza. But if you stole raw wool and you turned it into strings, then the Ramah said you can be Yaitza because you have a Shinui and Yush, or that's the Machlokes, the Taz and the Magen Avram. Either like the Taz, you have a combination of Yush and Shinui Hashem, or like the Magen Avram, even without Yush, you have a Shinui Maisa, so you could be Yaitza. However, says the Ramah, Miu lechatchila aser la'asaisan. Lechatchila, you're not allowed to do this. Lechatchila, somebody stole raw wool, he's not allowed to go ahead now and use this as tzitzis. He can't come along, lechatchila, and say, oh, I learned the Dirshu here. I stole raw wool, and I spun it now into threads. I'm cutting it either with Yish and Shiri Hashem, or I'm cutting it with Shiri Maisa. I have beautiful tzitzis. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, she'ekid yishanim v'tzeitzim tzivanu, v'lesatev bat tzitzis. Says the Ramah lechatchila, aser la'asaisan. You're not allowed to do this. Says the Mishnah Berurah, cut lamed aleph la'asaisan v'tzayin leimar. What does the Ramah mean when he says you're not allowed to make them? He means lahata la'tzitzis elu b'bigdai. Lechatchila, you're not allowed to attach these to your beged. Why? Mishum mitzvah ba'avera v'ayin b'bir halacha. Okay? Says the Ramah Vaiter, second line, middle of the line, or le'inyan bracha, as far as if you did do this, as far as making a bracha on such tzitzits, ay lekaman reish siman taf reish bem tes, he sends us to hilchas daled minim. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cutting lamed beis siman taf reish bem tes, the pasuk sham. Over there we paskin in hilchas daled minim, the ein yachal avarach alav. You're not allowed to make a bracha on daled minim, even if they became yours after you stole them through a shina maisa. You're not allowed to make a bracha. Why? Because of beitzei berech ni'etzes Hashem. A gazlan who makes a bracha on stolen property, ni'etzes Hashem, he disgraces the Rabbeinu Shalom. V'ayin b'shari tshuva u'bebir halacha. Now, there is a very interesting bir halacha here. See if I can find it quickly. It's here on Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph, Dibra Maschil, the Dafka Shagaz al Achutin. So, at the foundation of what the Ramah said is the fact that if you stole raw wool and then you spun it into strings, so you affected some kind of a shinui. And we're going back and forth between the Taz and the Magen Avram. Exactly what kind of shinui did you make? Did you make a shiri Hashem? Did you make a shiri Amaisa? Fine, we have a question. But it's very clear in the Ramah that if you stole strings, then you're not yoitza. Why? Because you don't affect any kind of shinui. Says the bir halacha, the Ramaskal v'dafka shagaz al chutin, ayin me Mishnah Berurah sifkat and chavches, b'masha kasavnu at what we wrote, afilu nisyashu abailim, that if you steal strings, even if the bailim were miyayish, you're not yoitza. Why? Because you didn't make a shinui. There was strings and there still are strings. For whom may I Beis Yosef? And the Chofetz Chaim says, I took this from the Beis Yosef. But says the Chofetz Chaim, l'chayra kasha. There's a very bomb kasha here. This still is, even if you stole strings, now you make them tzitzis, there's a shini Hashem. The meikar chutin, before there were strings. V'hashta achar she'etilim bebeged, now, when you put it into the beged, and you tie the knots, Hakricha shalamata, once you start making the wines and everything else, now that's not strings, rak b'shem gedil. Now it's called a gedil. When it was 4 loose strings, so fine, you're right, you stole strings, they still are strings. Now you take 4 strings, you put it into the hole in the beged, you double it over, you tie 2 knots, you take 7 of the strings, you hold them together, you take 1 string, you wrap it around, you make another 2 knots. Is it called strings? It's not called strings anymore. Either it's called tzitzits, or it's at least called a gedil. It's called a braided thing. It's no longer called strings. So what do you mean there's no shini Hashem? And he brings a raya for the Gemara Menachos, Kidubuch Menachos Daf Lamed Tes Amud Aleph. The Gemara Sham v'noy tchele shlish gedil. It's very clear that once you start braiding it, it's called a gedil. It's not called strings. So at the end of the bir halacha here, he's doichik. He's trying to figure this out. He says, "Ula yesh loimer de gedil hachutin mikri." Yes, you're still gonna call it string. You're now gonna call it a gedil. or you're going to call it tzitzis, but you're going to call it tzitzis strings. The strings of the gedil, but it's still called strings. It just has another appellation besides strings. Then he gives another possible teretz. He says, "Ay ulai," or perhaps Kevin diksiva asu lahem mishalahem beinan shiyu mishalahem be'ez tchilas ha'asiyah. He says this whole diuk of Chazal, this requirement that Chazal gives us that you need lahem mishalahem. Where is it in the pasuk? It's in the pasuk of va'asu lahem. They should make for themselves. That's where we get lahem mishalahem. So the Chofetz Chaim says. So this is not like the requirement of lachem by Daled Minim. By Daled Minim, there's a requirement that has to belong to you. Says the Chofetz Chaim, over here, the requirement of lahem is more stringent. It's va'asu lahem. By the asiyah, it has to belong to you. So before you tie that first knot, it already has to belong to you. And it didn't belong to you then, because then it was still called chutin. Fascinating, bir halacha. Okay. Now we go to Sif Zayin, back to Choshen Mishpat. Very interesting little sif here. Before I read the sif inside, I have to give you just a quick primer. We have, in the English language, we have a word, borrow. I want to borrow something from somebody. Now, we use that word borrow in any context. It doesn't matter what we're borrowing and why we're borrowing it. So, for example, if somebody is short, $1,000 before Yom Tov, and he wants to take a loan for Yom Tov, he goes over to his friend, he says, "Can I borrow $1,000?" If somebody wants to mow his lawn, and his lawnmower is on the blink, and his neighbor has a lawnmower, he goes to the neighbor, he says, "Can I borrow your lawnmower?" Right? He uses the word borrow in both contexts. Now, really, both those two contexts are very different. Why? How so? When you borrow your neighbor's lawnmower, you're intending to borrow the lawnmower, use the lawnmower, and then return the lawnmower. So you have the lawnmower for temporary use. When you borrow $1,000 from your friend, you don't have the temporary use of the $1,000. The person gives you the $1,000, and you're going to spend the $1,000. So the $1,000 are gone. Later on, you're going to give him back a different $1,000. In the parlance of Chazal, there's two different words for this. There's she'ela, there's borrowing something, and there's halva, there's a loan. And those carry two very different contexts. In the words of Chazal, halva lahitzah nitna, a loan was given for the purposes of hitzah, of spending. When you borrow $1,000, the person gives you the $1,000 with the understanding that you're going to spend it. And he's going to get back a different $1,000. She'ela, that's the lawnmower. That's temporary. So Chazal have two different words for this. The lawnmower is she'ela, and the $1,000 is halva. Now, how does that play into our topic over here of tzitzis? Well, we just saw that to be mekayim the mitzvah of tzitzis, you need ownership. It has to be yours. You need lahem, mishalahem. Therefore, we have a question. What happens if you borrow? What happens if you borrow strings and you make tzitzis? Are they yours or not? So let's take a look here what the Mechaber says. Excuse me. Says the Mechaber. Chutin she'ulin, borrowed strings. And what the Mechaber means is strings that were borrowed using the lashon of she'ela. You went over to somebody and you said, "Can I borrow these strings from you?" Now the problem is that you would jump up right away and you would think that based on what we know from Choshen Mishpat, a she'ela does not belong to you. Like I said, when you borrow the lawnmower is not yours while you have it, because the intent was he loaned you the lawnmower and you're going to return the lawnmower. So you don't have any ownership, you just have temporary usage of the lawnmower. Masha enken a halva, a loan, halva lohitzan nitna, milva lohitzan nitna. Somebody gives you $1,000, he gave you ownership of the $1,000 because you're going to spend it. And he's going to get back a different $1,000. So says the Mechaber, chutin she'ulin, strings that were borrowed, they were lent from one person to the other, you might think right away that, the person who's borrowing it has no ownership, and therefore he can't be Yotze the Mitzvah because he's not Mekayim Lahem Mishalahem. Says the Mechaber, no. Chutin she'ulin, borrowed tzitzis strings, even if it was done with a language of she'ela, halvahi. It is considered a halva, D'lo yahadru be'enayu, which is typically not returned be'en. The same item is typically not returned, right? When you borrow $1,000, halva is not hadri be'enayu. You don't give back the $1,000 be'en. You don't give back the same $1,000. You give back a different $1,000. So says the Mechaber over here, Chiddush, Reuven goes to Shimon, and he says, can I borrow a set of tzitzit strings? You might think, that's a she'ela. Reuven doesn't own it. He only has temporary usage of the strings. So he's not Yotze the Mitzvah because it's not Lahem Yishalahem. Says the Mechaber, no. Even though it was done with the language of she'ela, it's a halva. It has a din of a halva. Reuven owns it and he's Yotze the Mitzvah. Why? Says the Mechaber, D'lo yahadri be'enayu, because it's not going to be returned. Reuven is not going to return the strings that he borrowed. Says the Aruch HaShulchan, why not? Because it's not normal to take strings, tie them onto a beged, make a bracha, use it, be mekayim the mitzvah, and then untie them and give them back. So that's not the expectation, because that's not normal. Nobody does that. Elamai, the expectation, when Reuven went to Shimon and said, can I borrow the tzitzis strings? The clear expectation is that Reuven is going to take these strings, tie them onto his talus, go to Eichler's tomorrow, buy a new set of tzitzis strings, and return them. So you're going to get different tzitzis strings. So when Reuven borrowed them from Shimon, and Shimon agreed to lend them to Reuven, even if the language that was used was she'ela, the intent was clearly halva. Shimon clearly meant to give them to Reuven, and Reuven would attach them to his talus and give him back a different set of tzitzis strings, not the same set. Therefore, he transferred ownership to Reuven, and Reuven is Yotze the Mitzvah, ukididei dami, and it's like it's his. Beautiful, short, concise, kurz and sharf. A little sefer in Shulchan Aruch. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Gimel Chutin She'ulin Pirish. The explanation of this means is Kol Lashon She'ela. Whenever we use a language of she'ela, mashma, the implication is sheyachzer lo yoisa davar be'en. The implication is that the exact same item is going to be returned. That's the lawnmower. The lashon of she'ela is I'm going to borrow your lawnmower and I'm going to give you back your lawnmower. Aval lashon halva lo yitzan nitna. The language of halva is milva lo yitzan nitna. I'm going to give you $1,000 and you're going to spend it, and I'm going to get a different $1,000 back. V'ilu chutin she'ulin mistama heavy alva. And what the Mechaber is telling you is that when Reuven borrows tzitzit strings from Shimon, he means halva. He means lo hitzan nitna. He means I'm going to attach it to my house and you're never going to see it again. I'm going to give you different strings. The karina be'mi shalahem, and therefore you fulfill the requirement of lahem shalahem, and you can be mekayim the mitzvah with these strings. And it's as if it belongs to Reuven. But if we know for a fact, Shimon told Reuven, yes, I'll lend you these tzitzit strings, but I expect to get these same tzitzit strings back, then Reuven shouldn't make a brach on them. You see, if we don't know exactly why Shimon gave him the strings, let's say Reuven came to Shimon and said, oh, those strings over there. Now it happens to be that Shimon made those strings lishma. He made them l'shem mitzvah tzitzis. Otherwise, nobody could be Yotze mitzvah with them, right? But Reuven came to Shimon and said, can I borrow those strings? And Shimon said, sure, but I expect to get them back. So what do we see so far? Shimon agreed to lend them to Reuven, but the expectation was that he's getting those strings back. Then Ruvain, if he uses those strings to make tzitzis and he puts them on his talis, he shouldn't. The Mishnah Berurah says he shouldn't make a bracha. Why? Because we don't know why Shimon lent them to Ruvain. Maybe Shimon lent it to Ruvain so he could tie suitcases to the top of his station wagon to go away for Pesach. That's a little bit odd because, like I said, obviously these strings were made lishma, but there it is. That's what the Mishnah Berurah says. The Mishnah Berurah says, again, if Shimon lent the strings to Ruvain, but it's not clear that Ruvain borrowed them for tzitzis, and it's not clear that Shimon was lending them to be used for tzitzis, but what is clear is that Shimon expects to get the same strings back, then Ruvain can't make a bracha on them. Why? Because it could be that Shimon lent them to Ruvain to use to tie suitcases to the top of the station wagon. So Shimon does not know that Ruvain's using them for tzitzis, and he never transferred ownership to Ruvain, because why should he? And he said clearly that he expects to get them back. So it's a real she'ela, it's a real borrowing the lawnmower. He expects to get them back be'en. Avalim hishaloi tzitzis besukanim ke'en shalanu shem shizurim psukim. But if what Shimon gave Ruvain was, you know, when you go to Eichler's and you buy tzitzis strings, the way they come, everybody knows that those are tzitzis strings. If Ruvain came and asked Shimon, can I borrow those strings? And Shimon gave them to Ruvain, then he didn't give it to him to tie suitcases out to the top of the station wagon. It's tzitzis strings. Everybody knows it's tzitzis strings. So then Shimon gave them to Ruvain for use as tzitzis. In that case, says the Mishnah Berurah, then Ruvain could attach them to his talis and make a bracha, even if he knows that Shimon intends on getting them back. Why? If Shimon intends on getting them back, so what he means, and then it's a she'ela. So how does Ruvain have ownership? How is he become lehem mishalahem? You know why? Because since we know that Shimon lent it to him for use as tzitzis, well then Shimon knows that Ruvain has to own it in order to use it for tzitzis. He must have given it to him as a matana amenas lahachzir, even though it wasn't spoken out. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the bevadai nisanim loy b'matana amenas lahachzir, v'kamosh hakasim v'sim yadalid le'inyan talis. Stop over here. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. Discuss of limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shem should send Yeshuas, Refuas, Parnasa, Shidduchim to all those in need. Everybody's Pesach preparations should go easily, smoothly, with no tension, with no stress in the house, and it should be l'shem mitzvah, should be with gracious simcha, and in these chusim, we're in Chodesh Nisan, Rebbeinu Shem should bring the Bias Kol Tzedek, B'meher V'Yameinu, should be zeicha still to a carbon Pesach. Be well.